Welcome to our June webinar, and today's webinar is everything about Project Management Professional, the PMP certification. We have received a large amount of interest, and this is one of the few webinars. It's a relatively small one, as we wanted to make sure that we have an interactive session. So, given that we have a relatively small crowd, feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. It's a fairly relaxed pace, and what we really want to cover is everything about PMP, so to help you prepare for the exam. Incidentally, even though most of the information we cover are about PMP, with the exception of some of the examination and application detail, it's actually also quite suitable, this presentation, for CAPM as well. You have two ways of interacting with us. One is you can just unmute your phone. We do mute everybody for the sake of clarity, but you can just unmute your phone and ask your question, and we encourage that throughout the presentation. The second is you can use the chat, as some of you have already used as I ask, can people hear me? So please use the chat to ask any questions. Okay. So what we're going to cover today is really what is PMP, what is the history, what are some of the qualifications, how to best prepare for the examination, what are the biggest challenges, and what are some of the best practices, and as well as recommendations. So let's start with what is PMP. PMP is one of the most recognized project management certification. And this certification is globally recognized, so not just recognized in the United States. A little bit about the history. PMI was founded in the 1960s. And today it is probably the largest of the project management professional organization. What makes PMI very interesting is that it went global fairly early on. So today, as you can probably see, the PMI, especially PMP, is widely recognized throughout the world. There are some competing project management certification, but their effects are largely regional. So for example, in Europe, there is something called Prince 2, and it actually has a number of variations of that certification. But Prince 2 is really not very popular in the United States. It's really not popular in Asia or South America. So that certification, while still very useful, is regional to the European. One of the ways to look at what makes PMI or PMP very attractive is you could look at the growth. So for example, when I became PMI certified, PMP certified in 2004, I estimate at the time there was about 7,500 of us, which wasn't a small number for 2004, considering back in just 1999, I think the number was in the hundreds. But today, the latest number I think is 914,000 PMPs. So the growth of PMP, and if you just draw the line, looks something like this. And to me, that is the best indicator on the value of the PMP. Now, PMI did a lot of studies as well. Along the way, they looked at, for example, there's something called the PMP advantage, comparing salary and income for those who have the PMP versus those without. And they analyzed and surmised there's about a 25% compensation advantage in the United States for people with PMP versus project managers without PMP. In fact, the number actually is so strong that CNN, I think last year or the year before, actually did a special article on project management and mentioned PMP, or at least mentioned the PMI certification, that called essentially the PMI, the PMP, sort of the poor man's MBA. Question. Okay. Question, feel free to jump in. Don't be shy. But in the meantime, I'm gonna mute people if they don't have questions. Again, you can unmute yourself. So to me, this curve really exemplified the popularity of project management in general and PMP in specific. So what are some of the, why is it important? What are some of the values? And for those of you who's on the call, I'm probably already selling to a crowd that is at least have some notion of these benefits. But PMP offers a well-established project management methodology that can be applied to various industry. The certification itself is considered a gold standard in the industry for project management. It provides a basis for project management offices, for example, PMOs, to operate project in a more systematic as well as organized way. And as I mentioned earlier, there are substantial advantages. And one year it will show 20%, but latest actually shows a 25%. So you see a little crossed out, 20 and moving to 25%. And that's just in the United States. In countries like South Africa, that advantage is even higher, 40%. Okay. A little bit of history around the PMP, or at least some of the numbers around the PMI for those of you who are considering. There are approximately 2.9 million project management professionals globally. And this is an estimate that PMI as well as other organizations have estimated. By the way, this does not include people who actually work on projects. That number is significantly greater. In some organizations, project management is also a little bit misnomer. For example, when I was at one of the big Ford audit tax accounting company, I was surprised. I was the head of the global project services. And one day I was surprised why we have so many people with the title project manager. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm happy with the focus on project management, but that number just seemed a little too high. So as I learned about the organization, I quickly learned that project manager is actually a title at a particular level. So as people graduate from, let's say, the administrative role into more team leader role, one of the next role is project manager. So it's a level in the organization. But it also shows that how people and how organizations are viewing projects. They expect people at that level, which is usually above team lead or around the team lead level, all the way to fairly senior management, to play active role in project management. Okay. There are about 300 chapters of PMI around the world, and chances are there is a chapter near you. Now, I live in the Metro New York area, and right in our area, there are 2 large chapters. PMI New Jersey, for example, I think is the second largest in the world, with over 5,000 members. And New York City has, which is another chapter very close to us, has, I think, over 3,000 members. I'm not sure exactly where they rank in terms of size, but it is one of the bigger chapters. There are about 520,000 members around the world, and easily there are over 10,000 volunteers. The PMP exam itself started back around 1980s. And you could see that PMI held the first certification exam in Philadelphia and for 43 people. And by the way, some of those early people still maintain their PMP certification. In terms of qualifications, you have to, at the very minimum, have a high school diploma. And if you do have there, then you need approximately 7,500 hours of leading and directing projects. The key word is leading and directing. A lot of people do have project management experience, but it may not be leading a project or directing a project. So if you estimate that on average a person makes some work somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 hours per year, 7,500 hours is in roughly somewhere between 4 to 6 years of experience. You also need to have hours of education, in this case 35 hours. So that will suffice. Now, if you do have a 4-year degree, the amount of hours of leading and directing drops quite significantly, and it's only 4,500 hours. There are essentially 3 ways to prepare for PMP. And in some ways, you could use all 3 together, of course. These are not mutually exclusive. And later we'll talk a little bit about detail what are some of the best practices and what are some of the challenges. But keep in mind that PMP can be self-studied. I have known many individuals, have encouraged my students to prepare PMP by themselves. And of course, the pros are it's not very expensive. If today, I think on Groupon, you could probably even buy a class, even when it's not on sale, for something like $19 that can help you, give you some videos and rudimentary, and then you could prepare for the exam. So it's doable. The negative part of it, though, is it is very, very tough staying motivated. We have a participant in our boot camp who came back multiple times across multiple years, partly because this individual got married, have kids, got job promotion, just got busy with life. And so staying motivated is quite difficult. The other part is what sort of gets in the way, of course, is especially if you self-study and don't have a trusted source in which you can ask questions and get the answers that you believe in and that you trust in, is pretty much every time you get into a tough question, you're not sure what to do, you look on the internet, did some research, and chances are you may even find conflicting answers, you don't know what to do. Right. So that is staying engaged. And of course, if you have multiple issues and obstacles, then staying motivated can even be more difficult with that. The last part, of course, is the 35 educational hours. Now, for those of you who are in school, I know some of you may be in school, some of you may be in even my classes. Our class that we generally offer do count toward the education unit. So if you're in a university and offers classes in project management, chances are those count as well. But most people who are professionals out there self-study, those hours you have to somehow earn. So again, self-study clearly works. There are definite advantages. It's a lot less expensive, but there are also significant disadvantages. The middle of the road are study groups. The study groups are actually a fairly popular mechanism. I know both Project Management Institute chapters in New York and New Jersey, for example, offer study groups over time. And some of them are fairly well run. What that provides, of course, is now a support structure. You're studying with other like-minded people. You can help each other to navigate through the difficult challenges, and of course, prepare for the exam. The negative part of it is, again, unless you have a mentor or a Sherpa, so to speak, somebody you trust with the right answers, you could actually fall into the same problem. 3 people who are studying for the exam, chances are not experts at that moment. So having a trusted source of information to guide you can be a challenge. 2, you cannot earn any education unit, chances are, unless there's some kind of structured training or education. But study groups tend to be rather informal, and you cannot earn that. And third, one thing we found, which at least from our experience working with the various chapters, one of the most difficult things is for them to sustain a momentum. So the logistical issues of getting meetings or even regular meetings can be really, really tough. So for example, some years ago, we knew a very, very good profession who passed the PMP, who wanted to give back to the profession, spearheaded a number of study group sessions in one of the local chapters. And it was great for a while. I think first couple sessions, well attended, people were engaged. And of course, the person has the best of intent to continue that, except in this case, he got busy with his work as well as personal life. So very quickly, you could see that a couple months later, there is a little bit lost in interest. I shouldn't say interest, maybe same interest, but lost in priority of that individual. And so the problem with a lot of the study group is spearheaded by somebody who's very enthusiastic at the beginning, but that's really hard to maintain over the course of many months and many years. And by the way, it's not the fault of that person. As you can imagine your life, you get busy too, right? Our priority shifts and changes. And after all, this is volunteering. It's not making the money. We need to sustain life. And frankly, in the scheme of all things, it's probably not the highest priority, nor should it be. So study group is really good if you could get on a good one. The challenge, again, is sustainment or getting that sustained support structure over time. That brings to the third choice. The third choice are boot camps. The advantages are pretty significant. Usually you have the expert. Almost all group boot camps worth their salt should be taught by somebody who's certified. Otherwise, don't attend that. And preferably, it should also be by a certified PMI Registered Education Provider, REP. The Registered Education Provider is important is because those REPs have licenses to use PMI intellectual property. And so you can imagine trying to study for tests for a non-REP, somebody who's not certified by PMI, have no access to the intellectual property. It just becomes that much harder to deliver the course, study the right material for you to pass the test. But the right boot camps does provide the expert support. It really helps people accelerate the learning, learn the pitfalls. Some of the things you'll probably hear here in this presentation, they'll probably say the same thing. And also it earns education unit. So for those of you who's not naturally in the class having a lot of access to the unit, of course, that now you do. The cons, of course, is they tend to be more expensive. A good boot camp by education provider like Global Knowledge and IIL could be in the range of $2,000. Some are less expensive. There are a number of competition in the Metro New York area, including my own company. And I think, at least speaking for myself, we offer a very competitive product at, for example, $7.99. But there are others competition there as well. But nonetheless, even at $7.99, it is more expensive than self-study or free study group. So that's just a natural part. And of course, what you gain is more definitive information. What are some of the basics that you should do before you even start preparing and start thinking about it? Well, one thing is make sure you do have the prerequisite education background and experiences. So you want to make sure they're in place, because as you fill out the PMP certification, it's pretty black and white. Do you have leadership experience? How many hours or how many years? And can they be verifiable? The reason that PMI has a random audit process is to make sure people who ultimately go on to complete their PMP has the right experience. Otherwise, it diminishes the credibility and the value of the application, of the certification. Also, even though it's 35 hours of training, we think you should think, a little bit upward, closer to 40 hours, just to give yourself enough. But 35 hours is the minimum, and 40 is probably something you should try to reach. And then, of course, start studying. So the basic is really understanding your educational background, passing the, make sure you could pass the audit, which also means that when you fill out the application, for example, make sure the persons you put in as your referral, give that person a call, send them that person an email, make sure they're still up and running and willing to help you through the audit process. Okay. The exam itself, this is where I'm going to spend a little bit more in-depth time. I know this is a simple slide, but the exam itself is a 4-hour, 200-question exam. This is where things get tricky. So on almost any of the major PMI exams, they are multiple choice exam. And with the multiple choice, you essentially have one correct answer. But the correct answer often isn't just simply being right. It's also the best answer. And keep the word best in mind. So generally on multiple choice 4 choices, you have one incorrect answer that should be pretty obvious. And by the way, if you take the test and you find yourself not able to eliminate any one of them, use with something and just move on. Fill in something because you don't really have a negative penalty for getting it wrong, so why skip it? but don't waste too much time on it, because if you didn't understand it, couldn't eliminate any answer, so goes that question. But chances are you should be able to eliminate one. So one answer tend to be obviously wrong. Of the remaining three, now it gets into a sliding scale. There is a relatively bad answer, but it could be right in some strictest sense. Then there is a competing answer that's pretty close. It's probably even correct in some ways, but just not the best answer. And then, of course, the last one being the best answer and the correct answer. So for people who prepare PMP well, chances are these last two choices, the best answer versus the next best answer, this is what they tend to stumble upon. PMP exam is an experience-based exam, meaning that it reflects how you as a project professional in your role of leading and directing project would perform in that particular scenario given in the question. So the idea is that if you're able to answer the question correctly, you should also be able to apply that in real life correctly. So the problem, of course, with any of these experience-based tests is that it is judgmental. It is subjective. It is very, very context-rich. As I'm sure you can reflect on your own experience, you probably will do something in one way, but do something completely opposite, even though you're facing the same problem, because the context and the environment is rather different. Right? Will you, for example, present the proposal to your boss versus to your teammate the same way? Probably not, at least not thoroughly. So here is where these subjectivity come in. And this is one thing that the boot camps, as well as study group, could help you the most. Try to give you sort of the tools, the ways to help you think that the PMI want you to think, and to help you pass the exam. So that's a quick summary of the challenges of the sort of subjective nature, the experience-based nature of the exam. Another big challenge is that for a lot of people is the sheer intensity. Now, if you do sort of quick, get your thumb out and just do some quick calculation, right? Most adults, when we read fictions, when we read things that's fun, could read about 200 words a minute. Some a little faster, some a little slower, but give or take around 200. When we read technical menus, things that requires processing, requires higher degree of concentration, they're not necessarily in our natural environment. You know, most people don't read, for example, User Guide or PMBOK, Project Management Body of Knowledge, as a fun reading, at least for your sake. I hope you don't. So it's not a fun reading. So if we have to read that, process that information, and think through, we could probably get 100 words a minute on a good day and slower on even a more difficult topic. So when it comes to reading the question on the exam, that falls into the more difficult nature, because at that point you are reading, thinking, analyzing, interpreting, putting yourself in that case scenario and figuring out what is likely the best course of action. So what I estimated is that for the most part, most people probably could get maybe 80 words per minute into the question. Now here's where the problem is. There are 200 questions. An average question of, let's say, a small paragraph with 4 answers is probably around 80 to 100 words. So right there, it will take you approximately 1 minute to read every single question. And of course, with 200 questions, that's 200 minutes. And if you think about it, there's only 240 minutes in the total exam. And that doesn't include time that you may need to stretch, to take a break, to spend a little more time on question. So that's what the intensity part of the exam come in. And by the way, most of us are adults, and adults, in some ways, our energy level tend to fall after the first hour, definitely perceptibly fall in the second hour. By the third hour, mental fatigue takes over. And by the fourth hour, we're pretty tired. So from our productivity perspective, it actually drops. Maybe in the first hour, we could read 100 words a minute. By the time we get to the second hour, maybe 80, 90. Third hour, even less. So unless you really practice and get yourself really engaged and really fine-tune your body as well as your mind for the tests, even just completing the PMP tests can be a challenge. So that's the first bullet. The second bullet is the experience disparity. There's quite a bit of significant challenge this for people who are more experienced. So what do I mean by that? If you are a relatively new project manager who just graduated from, let's say, MBA, and have a couple of years experience, so you clearly qualify, relatively speaking, you're still feeling new to the profession. And when you look at the PMBOK, there's far less things for you to unlearn. What happened to business professionals, project professionals with 20 or 25 years of experience is they probably have done things differently than how PMBOK outlined the work. So for those more senior professionals who have quite a bit of experience, ironically, it may be actually more difficult for them to pass the PMP because they, of course, now have greater opportunity for this disconnect or dissonance between what they do and apply every day versus the PMBOK. So this experience disparity, by the way, hits everybody. It's just the more senior you are, there's just more room for greater disparity. But what that means is that you have to almost put aside what you know, how you, for example, define and manage scope creep on your project, and sort of learn how PMI wants you to do it. And so this sort of bookish knowledge around PMI, drinking the PMI Kool-Aid, as I jokingly say it, is actually quite important. And again, it's just harder for people who have more experience. I think the ideal time for people to take the PMP, by the way, and I get that question a lot. So, people ask me, T, given what you have seen, I think the ideal time to take the test is actually around 6 to 8 years of experience. 4 years is a little bit on the light side, even though you qualify. Beyond 8 years, especially beyond 10 years, chances are you're very experienced. You have seen many ways of doing things, especially if you work cross-culturally, then it becomes even more greater experience, which is valuable, but not for the sake of tests. So 6 and 8 years is a good magical number. This is when you have enough experience to address the experience-based questions. Also, not so much experience that you have to unlearn and learn how PMI wants you to do things. So those are sort of the bullet 2 and 3, the experience disparity as well as the methodology. And we talked about the timing issue as well. So that's really the ultimate challenge for a lot of people. Oh, by the way, another question I commonly get is what is the passing rate for the PMP exam? PMI stopped publishing that rate, by the way, around the mid-2000s. They used to publish that. They used to even publish a score. Right now, we actually don't know the exact score in which you pass, but they do give you a breakdown, in this case, by the 10 knowledge areas. And they really look at your proficiency level. Are you above the proficiency, at proficiency, slightly below, or significantly below? We estimate that the passing rate, and again, keyword estimate, this is not something they publish anymore, hovers around 70%. So if you're on the 200 score exam and you get somewhere north of 140 questions correctly, you should be passing. On the fringe of things, maybe you don't, but that's sort of the minimal threshold. Ideally, of course, you prepare and over-prepare to achieve more than 70%. In terms of the percent of people passing the test, again, that is not a number PMI published. We no longer know that. Anecdotally, working with a lot of our clients, people who take our boot camp, I actually spent a good portion of last year's summer with a large organizer of these exams. And when I say large, really a lot, 20,000 people taking the exam, for example. The pass rate they see hovers around 60%. Sometimes on a good day, maybe 65%. So meaning that approximately 1/3 of the people fail and 2/3 of the people who goes on to pass the test. Okay, so those are some of the numbers we see. What are some of the best practices as you consider the PMP? And I know I get that question quite a bit from our customers, even from my students. One is develop a plan. Give yourself a steady schedule. My recommendation generally hovers somewhere between 90 days to 180 days when you are serious about preparing. Don't really spend more than half a year. Chances are you're going to get too distracted. It is very hard to maintain momentum and motivation beyond half a year. On the other hand, PMP is big enough that you cannot easily do unless you already started reading, just taking a course, to do it below 90 days. I mean, can you do it? Of course. People who have done it in 60 days or even 30 days. But the amount of knowledge that the PMP requires, which is approximately 700 pages of the PMBOK guide, is fairly dense. So my suggestion is plan a 90-day cycle. If you really want to be aggressive, of course, you could do it in the 60 days. But make sure that you spend on average an hour to 2 hours every single day. And don't go skipping more than 1 or 2 days in between. So if you didn't study one day, then of course make up the hour next day. But if you skip a week at a time, you'll lose momentum. In general, studying for PMP, especially if you self-study, I would say plan to spend around a little bit north of 200 hours. And if you do the math, you could see in a 3-month period, which is roughly 100 days, give or take, on average, you need to spend 2 hours per day. So that's the math that you're looking at. So it's important to develop a pace, a plan, and build that momentum. Take the time and plan well. What you should do is before you take the test, you know there's 4 hours, plan how you plan to spend that 4 hours. Generally, we recommend people take the test in sprints, 2 or 3 sprints. So let's say 2 sprints. That means in the first 2 hours, at the very minimal, you should finish 100 of those questions. Otherwise, the next 2 hours, you have 100 questions left, and chances are you're going to be more tired. So ideally, if you plan it in 2 sprints, then chances are you probably want to hit about 110 to 120 questions in the first 2 hours, knowing that mentally you'll be tired and your pace will slow down. Plus, ideally, you save some time at the end for you to review the answers, especially the ones that you're not sure between the boundary of 2 choices. Third, take regular tests. Now, regular tests, unfortunately, is very hard to come by. There are some on the internet you could find, but the quality is iffy, and you can find them for free. So if you type PMP sample questions, PMI published some. Actually, let me go to PMI website, and you can see that PMI even published some sample test questions, for example, that you can find. But it's just giving you a flavor of things. I actually am one of the contributors to the latest of the PMI guide for the PMBOK 6. So you could see some of the questions, but it's just giving you a flavor. Ideally, if you want access to a lot of questions, you do have to look at a provider, service provider. You cannot really buy it easily on the market. There are books out there with questions, which you can do, but they also add up the costs. So this is where boot camps becomes better. But nonetheless, what you want to do is practice taking the tests because that's going to be important. Study group. I think study group is a wonderful option if you could find them. The problem with study group, as I mentioned, is 1, do you have the experts? 2, can you earn the education unit? And 3, do they maintain that momentum? One of the most frustrating thing I know for people is they're really engaged and all of a sudden they found that some of their people no longer are maintaining that momentum and study group. So that becomes a real issue. So that becomes a real issue for people studying the study group. Lastly, make sure you can, if you especially want to accelerate the process, go and attend a PMP bootcamp. This is going to be the most helpful. New Jersey chapter of PMI, for example, offers a bootcamp as well. These are things for you to consider. And I'm not here to push you to my product. I think we offer a superior product, but I want to make sure that all of you find the right tools and the right to help you exam. Okay. So these are some of the good practices that we talk to our members quite frequently. So some recommendations, things I sort of already mentioned multiple times, but one, stay motivated. PMP is hard. Even if you go to boot camp providers, you still have to motivate yourself. Because if you think about it, right now the exam, the PMBOK, has 5 process groups, has 10 knowledge areas. Crisscrossing the two, you have 49 processes. Each 49 processes have multiple inputs and outputs, tools and techniques. To memorize, and maybe memorization is too strong, to process that level of knowledge and memorize at least a good chunk of it requires a lot of time and a lot of motivation. So make sure you find yourself, give yourself a reasonable schedule, a plan of attack, so to speak, and along the way, reward yourself, which is actually bullet number 3, develop a way to measure progress. So for example, one of the things we do when people come to our bootcamp is we have our own exam simulator. And people who could take it, there's multiple modes, but they get a score. So when they get a score, and the score is actually pretty closely correlated with passing, meaning that people who gets, let's say, 80% consistently in our simulator pretty much pass the test, I think at around 80%. People who get 70 and go take the test, for example, is right on the fringes. So we have our own methodology. Our methodology, by the way, is quite simple for people who come to our bootcamp, and I'll be happy to share it, is using our exam mode, take the test, and pass it at 85% 2 consecutive times within a 7-day period. So it's not, 70-day period, knowledge still fresh, and go take the test within roughly a week's time. We have 100% pass rate. We actually, across all our bootcamp, we never had anybody who failed who used that methodology. As a matter of fact, we actually don't even have anybody who failed, even passing at 75% consecutively. But there we don't offer the money back guarantee. Since our skin is the game, we put the bar a little higher at 85%. So in our case, develop a way to measure progress is really simple. We have the metrics. And as long as you're making improvements going from 60s to 65 to 70 to 75, you know you're getting more ready. And jumping to the second though, as you prepare for your PMP, regardless of which methods that you take, whether you go individual, study by yourself, study with a test group, or go to a bootcamp, make sure that who you have or nurture a source that you can trust with the right answers. Because there are a lot of pitfalls on the exam, which is way beyond this webinar's ability to uncover. Because it's at every different level. It's at sometimes at the deliverable level, the input-output level, sometimes at the process level. So when you have these questions you're not sure of, you want to have a source of getting the best advice. Because without it, then you're sort of blind leading the blind. And that ultimately gets into trouble. So with that said, are there any questions before I go to the next part, which is really a walkthrough of the PMI's resources? No? Okay, so let's quickly take a look at the PMI resources, as well as I'll show you some of my company resources. And I forgot to even pull up some videos. We have 20-some videos out there about the topic, so I'll show you where to find it. But the first is the PMI homepage, which I'm sure everybody been to. And if you click certification, and you can see there's a certification, we're talking about the PMP, right? So that's the PMP homepage. And there you can find the basic information on the right, which are pretty important. PMP application tip, latest news. By the way, PMI is making some changes to the PMP exam. I'll come to that shortly. Some review tips, and then downloads. I advocate everybody read the examination content outline. To me, the examination content outline is probably the second most useful resources aside from the PMBOK. And for those of you on the on the call, I assume you know what PMBOK is. PMBOK is the project management body of knowledge. Very quickly, for those of you who don't know where that is, if you go to foundational standards, right now PMBOK is on the 6th edition. You should study for the 6th edition. Don't study any of the previous edition. Okay? But so that's the most important document. The second most important is the examination content outline. Now, it's a very thin document. Notice this date, June 2015, so it's about 4 years old. Okay? And what it does is it covers the examination outline in terms of the test questions. So the exam is outlined in 5 sections. They call it domain, which is really the process group for those of you who already started preparing. And you can see the breakdown in questions. 13% in initiating, 24% in planning, and so on and so forth. What's important about the examination content outline is that it is actually based on a study called the road delineation study, which they went to explain earlier on in the document. What that means is they went out to ask hundreds, actually in this case, thousands of project management professionals and ask the question, what have you done? What tasks do you perform? What are your project management activities? And what they do is then organize all that body of work and summarize it into the detailed tasks. So you'll see, for example, for initiating 13% of the exam, there are 8 major tasks. And there are a whole bunch of skills and knowledge. For planning, there are, I think, 13 tasks, and across 24%. These tasks are vital for you to understand. That's why I consider this document to be the second most important review documents as you prepare your study. Okay? So going back to PMP, the other documents that's good to read is actually go to this link, review tips and etc. And they give you many different tips, etc. There are even some sample questions that I showed you earlier. One of the things that you should read is also the handbook. It'll give you more up-to-date about the exam itself, the process of registering, the process of renewing your credential once you obtain it, etc. Now, let's look at some of the latest PMP exam changing. On December 15th, 2019, or I should say December 16th, is the first day of the new exam. The exam isn't changing so much in the sense of the knowledge areas. So the PMBOK 6 will continue to be the version of the standard that's based on. But PMI is updating the content outline. So exam content outline is being updated. I've worked previously, by the way, on teams with PMI. I actively volunteer with PMI. As a matter of fact, at this very moment, I'm actually in another meeting working on something else with PMI. So I had to apologize and take this webinar. PMI updates the PMP examination content roughly once every 5 years. 3 to 5 years. And by the way, even the PMI standard are updated once every 5 years. This is because it is aligned with the American National Standard Institute policy, which requires a review every 5 years. So the changes will be updated in the new examination content outline. Now, do I think the changes are significant? No. Do I think there will be additional twists and turns? Absolutely. So once you are ready to prepare for the exam, chances are, unless you do it right away, you'll probably be under the new examination content outline. So look for this to be available later in June 2019. So we're around the cusp. And what you saw before, this is still the old version because it is, of course, published in 2015, June 2015. So a 2019 version is coming soon. And perhaps one of the future webinars, I will discuss what are the similarities and differences between these two versions. But right now, I have not seen the new version as well. What are some of the additional resources? The handbook, as I mentioned, it's actually a pretty thorough handbook. It tells you all the details about the process, application process, audit process, etc. I want to quickly go to the PMO advisory website. As I mentioned, we have provided quite a bit of resources. People should really go through our blog site. We have a lot of interesting articles, and one of the latest we're putting is everything about project management professional. So here you can read at least our view. And most of it are things we already cover on this call. So in that sense, this is the Word version of the PowerPoint presentation that you have just seen. One other things that you want to do, and I'm going to actually Google it, a bit embarrassing, but it's Google easier to find things. If you click on the, just type PMO advisory PMP video, you'll come to one of the first hit is our video library for the PMP preparation. So for those of you that's interested to pursue further, feel free to take a look at our couple of short videos. These are all 5-minute, give or take videos on the various aspects of the PMP. So that could help you prepare. And we even provide some introduction to some of the chapters of our bootcamp. So for people can review that. Going back to the PowerPoint, I think that's all I have prepared for today. This group is a little bit quiet on the side, but we do have about 10 minutes for questions. Are there any questions? Okay, if there's no questions, then I will just finish off the presentation. As I mentioned, if you want, we have a full article. You could see that in the blog site. We do have upcoming boot camps for you to consider. And for those of you who are already PMPs, and you have to be already PMP, by the way, to claim a PDU, because this gives you fresh knowledge, the latest on the exam, you could use this claim code to claim 1 PDU. Oops, didn't mean to skip that. Okay. So let me come back. Are there any questions? Going once? Going twice? Okay, well, thank you very much for spending the last 15 minutes with us. Hope everybody learned something useful. And if you do decide to pursue PMP, best of luck as you look at and explore ways to study for the test. If you have any further questions, you can always email me and you could see or email my company and we will respond as quickly as possible. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful day.